On Monday, June 17th, the Karen Reed trial continued with day 26 in the prosecution's case in chief. On this day, the jury heard from 3 witnesses. First, they wrapped up the testimony of the prosecution's accident reconstruction expert, Trooper Joseph Paul. Then the Commonwealth called up another Legalbytes extraction expert, Ian Whiffin. Then the 66th witness to take the stand was Trooper Nicholas Guarino, who also testified as a digital forensics expert. Now, I know that I've said this a lot in this trial, but today was a disastrous day for the prosecution, particularly because of the testimony of their accident reconstruction expert. In my opinion, it was embarrassingly bad for the prosecution and for Trooper Paul himself. Let's get into it. Okay, so like I said, at the end of day 25, we did not finish hearing from Trooper Joseph Paul in his direct examination. And although witnesses will typically look pretty impressive while on direct examination, I was already seeing some big issues with his testimony by the end of day 25. But I figured maybe there was a chance that these things would clear up on day 26. And maybe Adam Lally would have Trooper Paul show his math homework at the end to show the physics of how he reached the conclusions that he did. But unfortunately for the prosecution, this did not happen. Nevertheless, Trooper Paul delivered his expert accident reconstructionist opinion as to what he thought happened at the crime scene.
What if any, conclusions did you come to through the course of your investigation?
So on Saturday, January 29th, 2022, at approximately 12:45.
So you can look at your report, but you can't read your report.
I'm reading my conclusions based on what they asked me to do. Okay.
Yeah. So I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Okay. So just take your time, read your report, and then answer Mr. Lally's question. And if you need to look at your report, we'll see about that again.
All right.
Ask the question, Mr. Lally.
Based on the totality of your investigation, what, if any, conclusions did you come to with regard to how this collision occurred?
So this collision occurred on Saturday, January 29th, 2022, at approximately 12:45 hours. A 2021 Lexus LX 570 was traveling southbound on Fairview Road, in Area 34 Fairview Road.
Objection, Your Honor.
Yeah.
It appears that.
So,
Sorry, I'm trying to oppose it.
You know what? Mr. Lally, break this down. Ask
Yes,
simple questions so that the witness can answer your questions. We don't need a narrative.
From your investigation, what, if any, conclusions did you come to as to where this collision occurred?
All right. So on the night of Saturday, January 2022, at approximately 12:45 hours, a 2021 Lexus LX 570.
Can you slow down, sir?
Yes.
So forget all that part,
Okay.
Trooper.
All
Just
right.
answer the question.
Okay.
Where did it occur?
It occurred in the area 34 Fairview Road.
And who, if anyone, were the participants in this collision sequence?
The operator appeared to be Karen Reed, and the pedestrian was John O'Keefe.
And where was the vehicle located in reference to the residents of 34 Fairview Road?
It was located along the southbound travel lane and to the left side of the house as you look at it from the front.
And as far as the vehicle, what, if any, directionality did it head in, and what, if any, interaction did it have with Mr. O'Keefe?
So the vehicle was traveling in reverse along the southbound travel lane, traveling north.
And how fast was the vehicle traveling and over what distance?
The vehicle traveled up to 24 miles per hour and approximately 62 feet.
And at the time that the vehicle was traveling approximately 24 miles per hour over approximately 62 feet, what, if anything, occurred then?
The right rear of the Lexus struck the pedestrian John O'Keefe.
And post-collision, what, if anything, occurred with regard to Mr. O'Keefe?
Mr. O'Keefe was projected forward and to the left along the front yard of 34 Fairview Road.
And post-collision with Mr. O'Keefe, what, if anything, did the defendant's vehicle do?
The Lexus continued traveling in reverse before they left the area.
And on cross-examination, Alan Jackson absolutely destroyed Trooper Paul as a result. It started when Jackson went over the educational background that Trooper Paul seriously lacked when it came to physics, kinematics, math, and biomechanics. And then Jackson basically turned this into a basic quiz of terms related to physics, kinematics, biomechanics, and more.
Define kinematics. That's yours.
It deals with the aspect of motion.
It's a subfield of what broader field?
Kinematics.
Kinematics is a subfield of what broader discipline of science?
I'm not sure.
I think physics, correct?
Yes.
And it describes how points and objects, systems of objects, how they move, and how the rate they move and the rate of their velocity, correct?
It deals with emotions.
What's that called? The rate of velocity. What's another word for that?
The rate of velocity?
Correct.
I mean, it deals with motion. It deals with forward, and also deals with speed. It deals with travel and speed. If something's moving, it also has a speed to it.
Right. The word you're looking for is acceleration, correct?
Sure.
What role does acceleration play in the field of kinematics?
What role does acceleration play in kinematics?
Correct.
It talks about, like you just said, it talks about the speed and talks about motion.
Is kinematics also known as the geometry of motion? Is that correct?
I have not heard that.
Never heard that. What's the difference between constrained and unconstrained motion?
Constrained and unconstrained motion.
That's what I asked.
Constrained motion. I can't recollect at the moment.
Constrained motion is motion on a predetermined path, isn't it?
Yes.
Unconstrained motion is what?
When it doesn't have a predetermined path?
Free movement, correct?
Correct.
You could remember that from your class?
For the most part, we don't go that in depth of constrained and unconstrained.
Constrained and unconstrained, not restrained.
That's what I said. Sorry, unconstrained. Yes.
So right off the bat, we could see that this was going to be a very painful cross-examination for Trooper Paul. Now, one very key point in the cross-exam was when Jackson pulled up the same diagram he saw in Trooper Paul's direct examination, showing the debris field and where he said the area of impact was. Jackson pointed out the various objects on the diagram, like the pieces of plastic, John O'Keefe's body, and more. And then Jackson showed Trooper Paul a photo taken at the crime scene of a piece of plastic taillight that was found all the way over by the fire hydrant. And when you look back at the diagram, you can see that this fire hydrant does not really fit in the line of debris field. And as it turns out, Trooper Paul didn't even know about this piece of taillight, and so he didn't factor it into his calculations as to where the area of impact was. So on cross-examination, he was basically forced to change where he plotted this point on the diagram. And this highlights basically the theme of Jackson's cross of Trooper Paul. Trooper Paul did not use basic math or physics for his accident reconstruction, nor did he do any amount of due diligence to use the evidence that was readily available to him to use in his calculations. Here's another example. After Trooper Paul was forced to replot the area of impact, he also then had to calculate the distance John traveled to get from that point to his final resting place. This was somewhere around 30 to 40 feet. Now, Trooper Paul also testified on direct that loose objects tend to get separated from the person earlier after the impact. So Jackson asked Trooper Paul, if that's the case, how do you explain how John was found with his drinking glass right next to him? And at the same time, how do you explain John's phone being found underneath him? Now, Trooper Paul did not have good explanations, just basic theories that he seemed to be pulling out of thin air as to how it could possibly be that those would end up in those spots. And speaking of that glass, Trooper Paul also testified that he concluded that the glass found on Karen Reed's bumper was the same glass found by John O'Keefe. And then Jackson asked him, well, what about your colleague from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab who said that the glass on the bumper actually didn't match the glass cup? Trooper Paul was like, well, I didn't know about that. So basically, it sounds like he never talked to anyone handling any of the pieces of apparent plastic or the apparent glass to find out what they were actually concluding so he could incorporate any of those conclusions into his calculations. And this is basic due diligence that any expert witness should have done. And to me, this feels like yet another example of the Canton PD, the Massachusetts State Police, and the prosecution itself just being the junior varsity squad here. And what's more, specific to Trooper Paul, his answers to so many of Jackson's questions were just so unprofessional. When asked to explain the existence of some other piece of evidence which doesn't fit into Trooper Paul's conclusion, he'd say things like, well, I don't know, I wasn't there. It's like, sir, that's why you're here. You're the expert. You're not a lay witness. You're supposed to be the one to provide calculations or scientific explanations so that the jury can bridge that gap. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he gave one response that maybe was just given because he was I don't know, maybe buckling under pressure or something. But I just could not handle what he said. In this instance, Jackson was pulling teeth, trying to get an explanation for Trooper Paul as to who gave Trooper Paul the information about the crime scene so that he could base his conclusions off of that. Jackson was just trying to get the source of his data, which is a reasonable question for an expert witness. But here's the awkward response that Trooper Paul gave him.
When you did your reconstruction and your analysis, were you informed that none of the glass pieces, not one of them, could be matched to a cup?
I don't know anything about I don't know that.
So if you knew that the glass pieces on the bumper do not match the cup, does that change your opinion
Objection.
about that glass?
Can you answer that question?
I cannot.
You can't answer the question.
It's what was told to me as evidence
Got it. By whom?
by the crime scene.
Who told you?
As crime scene that was there, it says it's glass from the cup. When I did my initial inspection, that's what it was on from.
That's not what you just said. You said that's what was told to me.
Yeah, by crime. Yeah, I can see by crime scene. While I was at my inspection,
Wait, what?
it was told to me by the crime scene when I was at my inspection, at the initial inspection.
So what you meant by that's what was told to me is the crime scene talked to you.
Yes.
Crime scene say anything else?
I don't know what else you want me to say.
Anyway, before closing it out, Jackson asked Trooper Paul about the triggering events that were labeled 12629A and 12629B. One of the things he did was he went over whether 12629A was a U-turn or a 3-point turn. And like I said in the day 25 recap, turns out Jackson read it the same way that I did. But other than that, Jackson didn't really need to get into the nitty-gritty details of each event. Rather, he focused on the definition of key cycles and then turned to the main chart where you can see the listing of all of these triggering events. So on direct examination, Trooper Paul said that there was a listing of key cycles that started with key cycle number 1164. The key cycles that followed 1164 were apparently all Trooper Paul's testing. Basically, he could confirm that, and that was settled with everyone across the board. Jackson really worked to make that super clear to the jury before he proceeded. And then Jackson pointed to the two entries that showed the 12629A event and the 12629B event. And he pointed to the key cycles that were listed for each of those. As it turns out, they're both listed as key cycle 1162, meaning that they took place during one key cycle where the car was off, it was turned on, and then it was off again. And so Jackson got the witness to agree that his conclusion relies on the idea that there were two key cycles in between the one where Trooper Paul said that Karen hit John at 34 Fairview Road and the one where Trooper Paul started his testing on the car. The problem with this is that there's been a ton of evidence showing Karen or someone else driving that car in between those events. And so there had to be more than two key cycles in those trips. Counting back, here's what Jackson tallied. Starting off, key cycle 1164 was Trooper Paul's testing. And before that, the SUV was driven into Canton PD Sallyport. So that's key cycle 1163. Before that, it was turned on to get the SUV onto the tow truck. That was key cycle 1162. Then key cycle 1161 was when Karen drove from Meadows Ave to her parents' house in Dighton. Then key cycle 1160 would have been Karen driving from John O'Keefe's garage to Gemma Cabe's house. Then key cycle 1159 would have been Karen driving from the waterfall to 34 Fairview Road back to Meadows Ave. And as Jackson pointed out, key cycle 1159 was not documented in this chart as having any triggering event. So that is really, really bad for the prosecution's case in chief. Now, one final highlight. I mentioned in the day 25 recap how we needed some kind of explanation from Trooper Paul as to how he concluded that John O'Keefe rotated his body so he was sent off to the side from the vehicle. If he was going to be rotated, he needed to say where he thought John O'Keefe was hit on his body, and it needed to be a spot where it would cause sufficient rotation. Well, when asked on cross-examination where the car hit John's body, Trooper Paul said he was hit on John's upper arm. And so he explained that John's upper arm was cut up like that because the taillight shattered. Now, to me, this was absolute lunacy because there's no way a taillight shatters when it comes in contact with an adult arm. It's the arm that should shatter, not vice versa. And there's no evidence of any bruises or broken bones bones on John O'Keefe's arm, so there's just no way that this could have been the main place of impact. Also, the arm is on a hinge. It's not the main part of the torso. So to my knowledge, it would not cause John to rotate. It would cause John's arm to break, dislocate, or even come right off. So again, this doesn't make any sense. And I have a feeling that when we finally hear from the medical examiner, we'll find out that that testimony also doesn't match what Trooper Paul said here. Now, there was more to the cross-examination even still, and so I highly recommend that you go and watch it. By the end, I think that Jackson completely destroyed the accident reconstructionist testimony as thoroughly unreliable junk science. This was very important testimony for the prosecution's case in chief. They needed this testimony to establish causation here, and it simply is not enough to prove causation, not by a long shot. So I do not see how the prosecution can come out of this securing a conviction. I would have hoped, for the prosecution's sake, for a second accident reconstructionist who actually used physics as a foundation for their calculations. But from what I've heard, the Commonwealth should be wrapping up their testimony on Thursday or Friday, and apparently they have 2 witnesses left. Both of them are medical examiners. So I don't think we are ever going to get evidence of causation in this case. Anyway, the next witness was Ian Whiffin. He is a decoding product manager for Celebrite, and he testified as an expert in digital forensics. His testimony was really all about bolstering and supporting the conclusions of Jessica Hyde from day 25. And I will say that for my part, I noted in the day 25 recap that I had had the luxury of time to pause, replay, and take notes while watching Ms. Hyde's testimony. And this really helped me understand and actually get convinced by Ms. Hyde's explanations that Jen McCabe actually probably did not search Haas Long to die in cold at 2:27 a.m. on January 29th, 2022. But when you think about the actual jurors' experience of taking in this testimony, I wasn't sure how much they would have picked up in real time because this is highly, highly technical. And on top of that, we don't necessarily know what kind of a background these various jurors have with tech. And so for my part, with Ian Whiffin's testimony, I don't have time to go back over it multiple times this time around to really get an understanding of his explanations. And I have to say, the real-time experience for me personally felt like trying to drink from a fire hose. To me, he seemed to be even more long-winded and got really into the weeds of things very quickly. And now, having gone into depth on Jessica Hyde's testimony, I can understand the need to go that deep to properly explain the testimony here. That's why the day 25 recap is so long after all. But the thing is, if you lose the jury in the process of the testimony, they are not likely to absorb the testimony to any substantial degree. And that's the thing about expert witnesses. You can have the world's leading expert on a particular topic, and they might not necessarily be a good expert witness because they don't know how to explain it to a lay person who knows literally nothing about the subject. It's like when I was in law school, some of my favorite professors were adjunct professors because they were practicing attorneys. They were used to explaining law to regular people like clients. So they were generally much easier to follow and to understand quickly. But there is another requirement for good expert witness testimony, and that is good questions by the attorney on direct examination. A skilled attorney can cut off an expert when they are getting too far in the weeds for people to follow, and then instead ask another question that helps to redirect the witness down an understandable path. But apparently, Lally just is not that guy. So despite the fact that going into this direct examination, I felt like I had a fairly decent, albeit introductory, understanding of a lot of the concepts that he was talking about, his explanations just ended up kind of confusing me, and I had a very hard time following along. For example, it seemed like Mr. Whiffin testified that there are basically 2 types of deletions. There's a deletion by the user in the sense that we commonly think about, where someone, for example, deletes a text message from their own phone. Then there's a deletion that's basically done by the system in its normal functioning. It's like your phone doesn't need a record on a temporary file anymore because it's already being reflected in a permanent database. That kind of thing. So it sounded like he said that there were no searches that were deleted manually by the user, in other words, by Jen McCabe. But I think there were searches that were deleted by the system, perhaps. This really was not at all clear to me, so I don't know what the jury is likely to do here with this particular bit of testimony. Anyway, the final witness of the day was Trooper Nicholas Guarino from the Massachusetts State Police. He also testified as a digital forensics expert, and he did not finish his direct examination on day 26. Basically, there were 2 things that I picked up on here. Number 1, he testified that he was the guy who tried to get the data from the SUV's infotainment system. Remember how I said that there is a lot of valuable information that could have come from this because of the fact that it has GPS, it has timestamps, it has so much there that could be used. But long story short, All of these attempts to get the data from the infotainment system were unsuccessful, and all the data that they got was corrupted data. And apparently the process of trying to extract it is a destructive process, so there's no way of getting it back now. Now, it could be that his reasons for why they were unsuccessful were legitimate and outside the control of the Massachusetts State Police, but honestly, we've seen so much in this case that shows incompetence by the Canton PD and the Massachusetts State Police that I wouldn't be surprised if the jury looked at this with some skepticism. Anyway, the final thing that he really testified about was a series of text messages between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe from January 28th and 29th, 2022. These were extracted from Karen's phone. And basically what was revealed was that Karen and John looked like they got into a huge fight earlier in the day that didn't really get resolved, but maybe kind of got put onto a back burner when they went out that night. In the meantime, Karen had tried calling John throughout the day like 18 times, and all but 3 of those calls were either ignored or outright dismissed by John. Basically, my impression here is that these two seem to be caught in a cycle of anxious attachment and avoidant tendencies. Now, I am not a relationship expert, but I have learned some things from the work of Esther Perel and other actual relationship experts. And so along the way, I've learned a few concepts that have been helpful to me and to other people in my life who also have relationships. And so the kind of cycle that I'm talking about here is basically where you have one person that has some kind of high anxiety in the context of a relationship. And to relieve that anxiety, their instinct is to move closer to their partner when there is a dispute. But the other person has maybe an avoidant tendency, which means that when there is a dispute, they want to do the opposite. They need space. So this can create a cycle where one person needs closeness, so they reach out to their partner, and where the other person needs space, so they distance themselves from their partner. The more one tries to attach, the more the other avoids, and vice versa. And so the less John responds to Karen's phone calls and texts, the more wound up she gets. Given that the jury was shown texts from Karen to John at like 12:55 a.m. and 1:04 a.m., where she's trying to get attention from him by saying things like she's leaving his house to go home, this actually informed me as to why Karen got so wound up so quickly in those early hours of January 29th, 2022. Really, it seems to me that she had never gotten that resolution to the argument from the day before, and so when he was presenting the ultimate distance from her, she completely lost her mind. So to me, I see these text messages as actually being more helpful to the defense than the prosecution, but I can see a different interpretation from someone else, perhaps. And of course, we still have not heard the end of Trooper Guarino's direct examination. So maybe there are more text messages to come. We'll see. But all in all, this was an absolutely destructive day for the prosecution. To my mind, there's just no way that they can meet the causation element for the murder charge now that their accident reconstruction expert was thoroughly discredited. But maybe you have a difference of opinion, and if so, let me know in the comments down below. As I like to say, I'm just one person, and the jury is made up of 12 here, so there's always room for more perspectives. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more Karen Reed trial coverage, both in daily recaps and in live gavel to gavel streaming, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out. And if you really want to support the channel, consider becoming a member of Bike Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by supporting on Patreon. And doing so means that over the long term of this channel, we can continue to devote intensive resources to trials like this one and other interesting legal topics. See you on day 27.